We were talking last time about various aspects of structure. And I have mentioned that a novelist or any writer can gain the attention of a reader by focusing on four principal points or four principal aspects of the work. One is family. Another is architecture. Another is space. Another is food. And as I look through the articles that have been published since 1981 through 1997 and try to find some subjects that you yourself would be inclined to read, and of course you will conduct these data searches yourself, I see a book in 1993 published by Twain Publishers, written by Martin Bucco, called Main Street, The Revolt of Carroll Kennicott. So we know that we're going to be dealing with sociological issues. We know we may even be dealing with issues of government. One came out of Australia called Matilda on Main Street, Naturalizing Australian Literature for American Readers. How are Australian readers supposed to understand Main Street? I think they should handle it very easily. In 1987, a three-page article appeared from Beijing, China, entitled On the Main Characters in St. Clair Lewis's Main Street. So we know that Australia, Germany, China have people and scholars in those countries interested in Main Street. In the Journal of American Studies, Joel Fisher has an article called Sinclair Lewis and the Diagnostic Novel. How do you identify the problems and how do you divide the parts of the novel so that people understand them? Well, we can go on and on. There were something like 39 articles published between 1981 and 1997 just on Main Street alone, and some 121 items on Sinclair Lewis. So there's plenty to deal with. But let's go back and ask whether anyone in the interim has found details of family or ideas about family interaction in Main Street that absorb our attention. Mr. Dornbus, you have your hand up.
Yes, sir. Page 427. The barbershop scene. Kind of, there seemed to be sort of like a family-like comfortable familiarity with all these guys as they're discussing family and friends and all that stuff and talking about Carol and so forth.
That's in Dell's barbershop?
Yeah, Dell's barbershop.
You want to read a short passage from there?
Sure.
All
Just
right.
let me know when you want me to stop.
Go on.
Dr. Westlake.
I mean, what you're looking for is the exchange. You have this intimate community where the barbers are talking, where the barber is talking to his customers. They understand each other. They feel for each other. The barber always acclimates himself to the will of the customer. And so what we're concerned about here is who is talking, what are the comments of the speakers, and how does the barber scene become kind of a insular world of family relationships focusing on the elements of the community and on the events affecting Eric and Carol. Go on, and others.
Dr. Westlake, Sam Clark, Nat Hicks, and Del Snaffen were talking in Dell's barbershop. Well, I see Kennicott's wife is taking a whirl at the restroom now, said Dr. Westlake. He emphasized the now. Dell interrupted the shaving of Sam, and, with his brush dripping lather, he observed jocularly, "What'll she be up to next? They say she used to claim this burg wasn't swell enough for a city girl like her, and would we please tax ourselves about 37.9 and fix it up all pretty, with tidies on the hydrants and statues on the lawns?" Sam irritably blew the lather from his lips with milky small bubbles and snorted, Be a good thing for most of us roughnecks if we did have a smart woman to tell us how to fix up the town. Just as much to her kicking as there was to Jim Blosser's gassing about factories, and you can bet Miss Kennicott is smart, even if she is skittish. Glad to see her back.
All right, good. So on the one hand, we have people tearing her down. On the others, we have people who recognize that she has a certain acumen that they could use. But no one wants to pay additional taxes for the cost of these knickknacks and the cost of these decorations and the cost of these street artifacts, which are supposed to improve the town. Any other items about family?
There's
Mr.
Am I on?
Just announce your name.
Oh, my name's Scott Franson, sir.
Okay, Mr. Franson, yeah.
There's another incident where on page 142 where she's running for the candidate for state federation. She's pretty much going to win this, but the people, they want to tear her down, make her look as bad as possible, but pretty much backbite her. And I read a little excerpt from page 142. It's in the middle. They interrupted the formal business meeting to discuss Mrs. Edgar Potbury's husband.
All right. Now, what you in fact get is a litany of all the attacks and all the points they attack against the Potburys, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good choice.
They discussed Miss Edgar Potbury's husband, Miss Potbury's income, Miss Potbury's sedan, her residence, Miss Potbury's oratorical style, Miss Potbury's Mandarin evening coat, her coiffure, Miss Potbury's altogether reprehensible influence on the State Federation of Women's Clubs.
And what you have is this litany, this repetition, this almost incremental repetition of Mrs. Potbury's name with increasing disdain to attack her cars, to attack her hair, to attack the way she speaks, and it becomes a rather impressive statement of how people in a family situation, we're using family in the broad context, a social organization, who know they're going to elect this rather affluent and this powerful woman, and who know that they're going to tear her down. Well, we've looked at some elements of family. We've looked at some elements of architecture. We've looked at some elements of space. Now let's look at food. And if you remember, I suggested that there are three ways to look at food. Number one, what kinds of food does Sinclair Lewis discuss or present or detail in the novel? Secondly, to what extent does the imagery of food apply itself to writing? And finally, to what extent does the erotic impulse, the concept of ingestion and exchange, handle itself in this novel in terms of sexual ideology, sexual action, or sexual intrigue? Let's start with food. What kind of food do we deal with? Any observations? Has anyone found any food? Yes. So announce your names.
Andrea West. On page 24 and 25, when there's a description of the people in the train, the things that they eat, particularly that the farmers with perpetually tired wives and children going to new, of the same age, workmen going to new jobs, and their hands are filled with grime. Then it describes that this lady feeds the child a graham cracker, which the baby's laying flat on a seat and wailing hopelessly. The crumbs drop on the red plush of the seat, and the woman sighs and tries to brush them away. Soiled man and woman munch sandwiches and throw the crust on the floor. A Slovene iron miner's family. It describes that their seats littered with different things, including whiskey bottles. The news butcher comes through selling chocolate bars and lemon drops, and a girl child goes up and down the aisles to the water cooler, with a little paper cup, spilling it all over the floor. And it seems to me that if you compare that with his description of Dr. Kennicott and Carol in the restaurant and the food that they eat, that he's used this as a method to compare the social classes, because their food, they look under the glass cover of the dressing table on page 207, was a menu with the most enchanting dishes: breast of guinea hen, de vitris, pomme de terre, à la russe, meringue chantilly, gâteau Bruxelles, and then when they start to eat, to bring in the sexual thing, I think, maybe that as the oysters came in, not canned oysters in the Gopher Prairie fashion, but on the half shell, she cried, "If you only knew how wonderful it is not to have had to plan this dinner and order it at the butcher's." The difference between their type of food that they're eating and the type of food that the farmers and the common folk are eating on the train seems to really set class limits there.
Very good selections, and the detail that Sinclair Lewis employs, and indeed the duality of the meal of the poor and the meal of the affluent, is really an interesting comparison. Is there anyone who has an observation about the nature of writing as a measure of food in this novel? Well, of course, the fact that Sinclair Lewis himself has heard words and is now giving them back to us. And the fact that you're reading the words and enunciating them. This, of course, is the exchange. And this becomes part of the skill, because not a single word, not a single phoneme, not a single phonetic image, not a single graphemic letter would appear on the page were it not for the writer's actions. Yes, Ms. Ely?
On page 280, towards the middle, maybe this might be a stretch, but it says she realized they found little to say, that incredibly they were like the talked-out couples whom she had pitied at restaurants. Isn't that like they're starving for conversation?
Oh, that's good. Yeah, because starving, again, is food, but they're starving for words. Excellent. Sure. This is part of the understanding of the anthropological association of words and appetite. We all have an appetite for good dialogue. We all have an appetite for a good movie. Right. And when we don't get it, we're starved for entertainment. We're starved for theater. We're starved for a good newspaper. All right, let's move on to the final element of food, and that is the sexual reaction. Has anyone found any episodes that we could consider to be appetites satisfied or appetites denied in terms of love? Has anyone found any expression of that sort in the work? Well, I think when you hear what I'm going to say in a few moments, you'll be able to get into this last aspect because of the relationships between Dr. Kennicott. For example, I think you might find on page 20, turn to page 20 in the text. How does Sinclair Lewis describe lovemaking? He says, of the lovemaking of Carol and Will Kennicott, this is when they were dating. Of the lovemaking of Carol and Will Kennicott, there is nothing to be told which may not be heard on every summer evening, on every shadowy block. They were biology and mystery. Their speech was slang phrases and flares of poetry. Their silences were contentment, or shaky crises when his arm took her shoulder. All the beauty of youth, first discovered when it is passing, and all the commonplaces of a well-to-do unmarried man encountering a pretty girl at the time when she is slightly weary of her employment and sees no glory ahead nor any man she is glad to serve. That's what they enjoy. Turn to page 383 when they've had such problems. And Will realizes that his rival has been Eric Volberg. What does he say? She snatched up his hand. She kissed it. Again, taste. Food. I don't... Presently she sobbed, I won't ever see him again. I can't now. The hot living room behind the tailor shop, I don't love him enough for that. And you are, and she turns to him and says, even if I were sure of him, sure he was the real thing, I don't think I could actually leave you. This marriage, it weaves people together. It's not easy to break, even when it ought to be broken. That's Carol talking. And Will says, and do you want to break it? No. He lifted her, carried her upstairs, laid her on her bed, turned to the door. Come kiss me, she whimpered. Again, the appetite needing to be satisfied. He kissed her lightly and slipped away. And now we know that they do have somewhat of a problem. For an hour, she heard him moving about his room. They were in separate rooms. Lighting a cigar. There you have taste. There you have ingestion. There you have satisfaction. Drumming with his knuckles on a chair. She felt that he was a bulwark between her and the darkness that grew thicker as the delayed storm came down in the sleet. So you have these erotic episodes, and you have them intertwined with taste, and it becomes part of the apparatus of the mythography or else the anthropology that we're looking at as in a structural context in Main Street. Well, you think about that, because when it comes time to write your short paper, which is due listed on your schedule, and when you go to write your research paper, you can use some of the themes we've been talking about. You can use some of the themes of government or religion or economics, or you can go to this set of motifs, these structural elements: architecture, space, food, and family. Now what I'd like to do is look at chapters we haven't really studied to this point. And let's look first at chapter 31. Here we discover that indeed Carol is enamored of Eric Volberg. And she's in the bedroom with him to admire Hugh. And as she bends over his crib, his face touches her hair. And you've got this erotic response between the two. Carol fantasizes that not Will but Eric is Hugh's father. What a terrible existence Carol has made for herself. Finding a lover whom she can't have, and even suggesting that the child ought better be his. Eric kisses Carol, kisses her on the eyelid, but she resists the temptation, and he departs. This love for the time being presented. Now chapter 31 is divided into a number of parts. And the second part, ranging from pages 356 to 60, has Doc Kennicott warning Carol about the company she keeps. Carol's been talking to Mrs. Westlake, and Mrs. Westlake has a way of drawing out people's problems from them. Now, the way Doc knows that she's been talking to Mrs. Westlake is that Mrs. Westlake's been telling other people what Carol told her. Carol told her they're sleeping in separate bedrooms. The doc says she didn't have to know that. And he gets so mad, he says, well, just why didn't you advertise it in the newspaper? Why just tell Mrs. Westlake? Once you tell her, it's like advertising it in the newspaper. Let me read his argument, because when we look at Will as being a rather pacific figure, we don't often see him getting this mad. But he is really irritated. He says on page 357, whatever possessed you to let her pump you, bright girl as you are? I don't care what you told her. We all get peeved sometimes and want to blow off steam. That's natural. But if you wanted to keep it dark, why didn't you advertise it in the Dauntless or get a megaphone and stand on top of the hotel and holler or do anything besides spill it to her? He says people don't even read the newspaper as much, get as much information from the newspaper as they get from Ma Westlake. He says, what did you tell Miss Westlake? You told her you're going, Ma Westlake's been going around town saying you told her that you hate Aunt Bessie and that you fixed up your room because I snore. And you said Bjornstam was too good for B. And then just recent that you were sore on the town because we don't all go down on our knees and beg this Volberg fellow to come and take supper with us. God only knows what else you said. Well, obviously Carol feels isolated because Will. Then when she meets with Vida Sherwin, she finds out that Vida Sherwin was in love with Will once. They dated. And Vida Sherwin, who is now married, realizes it was a mistake that she missed out on Will. Carol empathizes with Vida Sherwin, who's learned to get along with the town and learned to live with her past. Both of them are reformers. Look on the third section of chapter 31. Carol responds to Aunt Bessie's efforts to pump her for information. She won't do for Aunt Bessie what she did for Ma Westlake. She asserts that she asserts Will's fidelity, but she leaves open the opportunity for herself to be criticized. She says, whatever I may do, I'll have you understand that Will is only too safe. Now, of course, Aunt Bessie's going to pick up on that. Whatever I do. Well, you've been with Eric Valberg. You were out on the lake with him by yourself. You've been in your home with him. And so this develops. And of course, in these chapters, we realize that Carol is very much in love with Eric. This is the man who inspires her. This is the man who she feels she should have loved. And as one of our earlier speakers mentioned, she doesn't seem to realize that Eric is just a farm boy. But he is a poet. And he has gotten her attention. When Carol returns home, Will is already aware of her conversation with Bessie. That's how fast the gossip travels in the town. We find finally in the fourth section of this first chapter that Carol contemplates leaving Will. And she realizes the problems he'll have with this. Look at page 360. She lay sleepless. She alternately considered ways of leaving Kennicott and remembered his virtues, pitied his bewilderment in face of the subtle corroding sicknesses which he could not dose nor cut out. Didn't he perhaps need her more than did the book-reading Eric? Suppose she never saw him again. Suppose he never again played elephant for Hugh. Suppose a country call, a slippery road, his motor skidding, the edge of the road crumbling, the car turning turtle, Will pinned beneath. She fantasizes all these problems he might have. And where would he be without her? She ran to his room. At her nervous push, the door swung sharply in, struck a chair. He awoke, gasped, then a steady voice. "What is it, dear? Anything wrong?" She darted to him, fumbled for the familiar, harsh, bristly cheek. How well she knew it, every seam and hardness of bone and roll of fat. Yet when he sighed, "This is a nice visit," and dropped his hand on her thin, covered shoulder, she said too cheerily, "I thought I heard you mourning. So silly of me. Good night, dear." And she loses an opportunity to be with him, and certainly he loses an opportunity to be with her. And we realize that this marriage is on the rocks. Hers is a one-way relationship, the way she wants it, and Will has to abide by it. When we go to point 5 of this chapter, Carol feels that the town is viewing her as a divorcee. They suspect an affair with Eric. And Carol has mixed feelings. She's ambivalent. She's not sure what she's doing. And when she sees Ma Westlake, she intended to ignore her, but she in fact responds in a very friendly fashion to her. And so we recognize Carol's ambivalences. She feels that she is the subject of conversation. She imagined, look at this phrase from this ironic phrase, she imagined men talking of her thick-voiced, obscene, in barbershops and the tobacco-stinking pool parlor. Indeed, they are talking about her in the barbershops, as Mr. Dornbus pointed out. And then we realize that Fern Mullins, the school teacher, becomes her close friend and ally. Now, once we realize that she is associating with Fern, that Fern's her closest friend, then Lewis plays the mean trick on us. He removes Fern Mullins from the scene and removes her in the most ignominious fashion, a teacher accused of having an affair with one of her students, Cy Bogart. Now, we've been reading in the newspapers about a woman who was recently sentenced to jail for 6 months and put on probation, not to meet with the young boy whose child she fathered, whose child she delivered. And when she was let out of jail, she was told not to meet this young man. She did in an automobile early at 2 a.m. in the morning, and she recently went back to jail for 7 years. A teacher engaged in a love affair, a torrid love affair, and of course a love affair consummated and one that eventually gave birth to a son. But this isn't Fern Mullins' story. Fern Mullins is one wrongly accused of being with this student, Cy Bogart, and we'll see how it works. And so Carol, aligning herself with Fern Mullins, gives Lewis a context by which to show how quickly Carol's hopes may be dashed. And so we move into chapter 32. The scene begins, the chapter begins when Carol hears Mrs. Bogart arguing, and she assumes she is arguing with her son Cy. She's always arguing with her son Cy. But instead she realizes that Mrs. Bogart is evicting Fern Mullins. And Fern Mullins is accused of getting Cy Bogart drunk at the barn dance. Now, if you remember, Carol was asked to be a host at this barn dance. She couldn't go. So Fern Mullins goes. Her job as a teacher is to be a sponsor at these school dances, at these various affairs. And Fern Mullins goes to the dance with Cy Bogart. The scene opened. And of course, what we do discover is the scene at the barn dance being reenacted by what Mrs. Bogart says and by what Fern Mullins says. Mrs. Bogart shrieks in the presence of Will Kennicott and Carol. Never before had her boy been drunk, shrieked Mrs. Bogart. When Kennicott grunted, she owned, well, maybe once or twice I've smelled liquor on his breath. Now, before they got her story, says Sinclair Lewis, she had 5 more minutes of obscene wallowing. Now remember, this Bogart is the fellow who pretended he wanted to go in the army, but whose mother persuaded him not to run away. And so during the war years, while others in town were in action, Cy Bogart was home, safe from the war. When Mrs. Bogart saw her son drunk, and in fact he was deposited drunk at the home, drunk and vomiting, Mrs. Bogart complained to the school board members, and of course not only to the school board members, but to the wives of the school board members. Now once you go to the wives of the school board members, that's the coup de grace. No one is going to turn down his wife when she is incensed against this dissolute and reprobate young school teacher, only a few years older than Cy Bogart himself. And she seeks the support of Professor Mott, superintendent of schools. He is so pure that he does not even drive on the Sabbath. Now that's a very extended archaism. If you remember in William Bradford's Plymouth Colony, written around late 1620s, when he is describing what happened in Plymouth, a young man was riding his canoe on the Sabbath and drowned. And the townspeople said that was providence. He should not have been riding on the Sabbath in this canoe. Well, here he is, 300 years later, Professor Mott, observing the Sabbath and unwilling to ride. He will be the one that Mrs. Bogart will move toward, who will direct the attack against Fern Mullins. Carol, with her superior air, critiques the town's attack on Fern Mullins. And Carol objects to the fact that no men of the town are man enough to controvert Mrs. Bogart's gossip. Sir?
I just want to comment. I just thought it was kind of funny and how true it can be that the gossip about Fern Mullins just kind of snowballed and, exaggerated the lie grossly. Like, went from taking a sip to drinking 2 quarts of whiskey and handing it out to other people and stuff like that. It just, I thought that was a rather hard truth about gossip and so forth.
Right, and you're ahead of me. Of course, Fern said that when Cy gave her the bottle to drink, just to appease him and not to anger him, she just brushed it across her lips. And it does grow. I've got, it grows into 2 gallons that she has drunk herself. And then when she departs to the railroad and she's forced out of town, there are people standing beside her who have heard that it was a whole case of liquor that they were drinking. You're absolutely right. I mean, Lewis has a good sense of humor, but he also knows the way gossip travels. Fern flees to the Minnie Mashie house, where she had a nice apartment in Mrs. Bogart's. The Minnie Mashie house is in deplorable state, owned by Doc's friend Jackson Elder. And Fern gives her version of the events. She describes the square dances called by Del Snaffin the barber. So Del was there, but he never saw Fern drunk, obviously, because she wasn't. And Carol claims that intelligent people are defying Mrs. Bogart's and Main Street's God. That is, everyone listens to what she says and no one else. Fern tells Carol the story of fighting off Cy's advances when she drove him home. They were in the car. He started vomiting. He had to get out of this buggy. He threw up around the carriage, and then he wanted to kiss her, and she had to brush him off, and then she had to drive him home. She describes him retching in the backyard, and then she recounts Mrs. Bogart's verbal attack in the morning. But she thought she was heroic. She thought she brought him home safe. She thought she had protected him even though he was obscenely drunk and accosting her. She thought she had done a good job as a teacher, that she had protected this young boy. But that's not the story. When Cy Clark is approached, we find out that he realizes that the board members will not be responsive. Carrie hears Mrs. Gogerling, who wasn't even at the barn dance, tell Mrs. Howland that Fern Mullins drank a whole bottle of liquor. Nat Hicks hears that Fern brought 2 quarts of whiskey to the dance. That she herself brought 2 quarts of whiskey. And she got drunk even before Cy got drunk, is the way the story goes. And then, of course, when Fern leaves, 2 strangers behind her recognizes her, and they expand the tale to describe Fern and other women. Fern and other women, now the story has gone to other teachers or other women, seducing young students with a case of whiskey. So now it has become an orgy, and it begins to spread. When Fern is away, Carol gets a letter from her and finds out that Fern cannot get a job as a teacher. The news has spread into other communities, and the door is being shut in her face. And Fern despairs of ever being so naive. Let's move on. And I'm going to go over these very quickly because you get the drift. You realize how cleverly Lewis has structured the story, giving us Fern Mullins as Carol's friend and then taking her away. Well, Carol continues her fantasies about Eric, and they actually meet near a grain elevator. And notice, 376, they passed a moaning clump of trees. Well, if you want to fantasize orgasm, I guess there's no better way to do it than to hear a moaning clump of trees. But Lewis, of course, has given us these images in the best way he can without being explicit. Eric reads a love poem to Carol. Actually, it's a pretty bad poem. And Carol is so happy, but she realizes she can't do more. She says, I am happy, so we must go home before we have time to become unhappy. But before they can leave this spot, Will has found out where they are. Will drives up. He meets them. He realizes that she is enamored of Eric. How did he find her? And Will says, if you look at the note, Will says, there's nothing in this town that you don't do in company with a whole lot of uninvited but awful interested guests. What amazing. And then you talk about family, right? As far as I'm concerned, this is probably the quintessential phrase of family in the novel. Let's look at it one more time. Can I have the camera on the paper? All right, I'll read it. Oh, good, good. There's nothing in this town that you don't do in company with a whole lot of uninvited but awful interested guests. Will pleads his own cause. Carrie refuses to submit to Gopher Prairie. She says Valberg alone appreciates her. Eric is an artist. Eric believes in God. But Will paints a bleak picture of Carol's being married to Eric. Eric is, after all, just a tailor. He works in a sweatshop. He comes from a farm. And his father wants him back on the farm. And we'll see in a future chapter where the father comes and pleads with Carol to let him go. You've trapped her. He calls Carol a prostitute, Valberg's father, for luring his son away from the farm and away from the tailor shop. But in this point, Carol and Will reconcile as he goes to his room. If you look at, and then we realize that Eric Valberg leaves for Minneapolis. He realizes that he simply cannot stay there if she can't love him. And she knows that she's in trouble. But she knew that she still had no plan in life, save always to go along the same streets, past the same people, to the same shops. What a tragedy she's having. In the third section of chapter 33, Carol confronts Adolf Valberg. Eric's father wants him back on the farm. Carol defends Eric against her father, and she threatens Adolf with Will's wrath. He says, if you keep bothering Will and keep bothering me, Will will get at you. But Will agrees it's time to leave, time for a vacation. And in chapter 33, well, at the end of chapter 33, everyone knows that Eric has left. They're waiting to hear something from Carol, but Carol and her husband prepare to go to California. The train to California stops at Minneapolis, and Carol is pleased to think that at least she's closer to Eric than before. Chapter 34 has their vacation. They visit all the hot spots. They visit all the towns on the west. They visit the mountainous areas. They visit the lakes. They visit California. They visit Santa Fe. And when they come back in a sleet storm, no one wants to hear about their trip. Or those who want to listen are more interested in telling them where they themselves had gone than listening to where Carol had gone. So even this final victory, the 10 minutes she lived in a romantic novel, don't give her the satisfaction when she returns to Gopher Prairie. Carol tells us when they come home that they've gathered a lot of materials on this trip. They've gathered miniature junk in an oriental drum from San Francisco, blocks carved in San Diego, a lariat in San Antonio, and all these little knickknacks, the knickknacks of tourists. Don't give her the piece she's concerned, the piece that concerns her. Carol is destined to housework. Carol volunteers for the Red Cross. And then we hear other stories of people in town for whom Carol has pity. Champ Perry, who no longer can work, and the small boys play tricks on him. Major Raymond Witherspoon, who returns from war wounded, and who is himself a sorry figure. These become the signs of the times, and these become elements of the world that Carol disdains, that she wishes to avoid, and that oppress her. But in the meantime, the war has come along. Will has earned $7,000 in land speculation. He's getting rich. And look the way at the irony. Remember I began by talking about irony? Will earn $7,000 in land speculation. And here is Sinclair Lewis telling us about society's values. 4 times as much as society paid him for healing the sick. Well, we know that this is a stable, overt irony. These are powerful chapters because they show Carol's despair. Now, whether the novel ends in despair, whether Carol has given up, that's a question you can answer. But for the next presentation, Mr. Robert Coyle is going to discuss Main Street and his perceptions about Carol Kennicott, Will Kennicott, and the events of Gopher Prairie. Coyle?
Thank you, Dr. Rothman. Okay, Dr. Rothman was speaking on chapter, or he got a little bit into chapter 35. Can you hear me on the, okay. I'd like to pick up where he left off. First of all, before I do that, I'd like to thank KUHD, which is the University of Houston television station, University of Houston, of course, and Dr. Rothman. I think that Dr. Rothman is an excellent professor, and I only wish the university had more like him. Okay, very good. First and foremost, let's go back to the published works and see how that comes in on the big scheme of things known as the publishing life of Sinclair Lewis. You already know where he was born and of his education. I would like to start off with his publishing career, which starts in 1912 when he published Ike and the Aeroplane, which is his first book. It was a boy's adventure story. Then in 1914 he married Grace Hager, and Grace Hager also wrote some years later, I believe at or after his death, it says 1951, she wrote a book called With Love from Gracie. I'm going to put that on the overhead so you can look at the cover of that real quick. Oh, there we go. That looks better. With Love from Gracie. 1917, The Job and the Innocents were published. His son Wells was born. Wells died prematurely. He died during the Second World War. Then in 1919, Free Air was published. 1920, Main Street was published. It was his first major commercial success. 1922, Babbitt. 1925, Aerosmith. 1926, Man Trap, which he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, but he refused it. As Dr. Rothman has stated, the Pulitzer Prize is for a single work, whereas the Nobel Prize is for a lifetime of achievement in literature. 1927, Elmer Gantry. 28, The Man Who Knew Coolidge. 29, Dodsworth. In 1930, his son Michael was born, and he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. I feel personally that the 20s, from 1920 to 1930, was the best of Sinclair Lewis. I think that he published his best works then. Okay, let's go straight off to historical events that influenced Main Street. Okay, first we have the end of World War I. Straighten that up. There we go. The end of World War I. During World War I, there was what was called economic mobilization. We had the Food Administration, which is voluntary rationing with wheatless Mondays and meatless Tuesdays. And beef and wheat consumption was reduced by 30%. But also the farmer's income was increased by 30%. It was a good time for farmers. The War Industries Board controlled production and distribution of war materials, fixed prices, allocated raw materials, and antitrust laws were suspended for the duration of the war. The National War Labor Board settled labor disputes and settled strikes. The War Labor Policies Board set standards for wages and hours and pattern for war industries. Why do I mention these? Because all of these played a part in his book. In the first few chapters, as you recall, following Carey and Kennicott's arrival in Gopher, Prairie, that was one of the main subjects of communication, especially among the Clarks and such. Okay, second thing is urban versus rural conflicts. More than 50% of the population, for the first time, were living in urban areas as opposed to rural areas. That created a class difference because you had the urban people versus the rural people. The rural farm owners were supplying the food, the urban people in cities were running the industries and so forth and so on. The reason I mention that is because of the fundamental difference between Kennicott and Carey. Carey was from the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and she lived in the city and so forth and so on. That was her home. Dr. Kennicott came from the city, and he was educated in his medical career, or his medical education, in Minneapolis and I believe St. Paul. And then he moved to the rural area. He moved by choice. He became a rural person living in a small town. Next thing I'd like to bring up is Prohibition. Dr. Rothman spoke of the 19th Amendment. The Prohibition was the 18th Amendment. It was called the Noble Experiment, and it forbade the consumption of alcohol in any form. And the Volstead Act was the legislation used to enforce that. The consumption of alcohol decreased, but crime increased, particularly crime in the cities. Fundamentalism. Confrontation developed over the teaching of the theory of evolution in schools in the South. The famous monkey trial of 1925 with John T. Scopes and the ACLU testing the Tennessee law. Scopes was convicted, but the conviction was overturned by a higher court. That is more into the churchgoers, the Baptist. When we get into my favorite phrases, we'll speak of the Baptist a little bit more. Okay. Last is nativism and xenophobia. After the war, a great deal of anti-foreign sentiment developed in the United States. And we had legislation such as the Emergency Quota Act in 1921, limiting the number of immigrants no more than 3% per year, and the National Origin Acts of 1924, which was enacted 3 years later, which required no more than 150,000 immigrants be accepted per year, and no Asians at all were to be allowed in. Another form of nativism was the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan in 1915. However, following the revelation in Indiana, the Klan lost much of its membership in 1927. That is also something that rears its ugly head within Main Street. Okay, let's go straight to chapter 35. We've already talked about the historical events that shaped this. Before we do that, let's talk about the fundamental differences between Kennicott and Carey. First of all, there was an age difference. Carrie was about 25. I estimate her age is about 25, maybe a little bit younger than that. Kennicott is 36 or 37. That's a big difference in ages. I don't know whether that's so much so today, but that certainly was back then. The young lady that I'm dating right now, there's a large age gap between our ages, and that's, of course, of a lot of concern to me. She says it's not really a problem, but I'm still bothered by it. I think that may be something that within this book and within their relationship may have been a factor. Let's talk about their domicile. Of course, we talked about Carrie, which is urban, and Kennicott, which is rural. Ambition. Carrie wanted change. Kennicott wanted the status quo. He wanted everything to remain the same. He just wanted to be an old-fashioned country doctor, as Dr. McCoy would say on Star Trek. Okay. Let's see. Let's go right on chapter 35. Town was booming. The wartime price of wheat was bringing a lot of money into the town, a lot of money for the farmers. As I had told you about the different acts during the war that stabilized the price of wheat and set price controls and so forth and so on. The price of wheat went up, and the income went up for the farmers, and they didn't know what to do with all this money. So it was really booming. So what they were doing was investing in land. The doctor got into this. Everybody started investing in land. It reminds me of, back in the 20s, there was a big land rush, and I believe Groucho Marx was investing in land as well. He was involved with that. I think he lost his shirt in that, but that's fine. He's a comedian. He can laugh at his own mistakes. I wish we all could be that lucky. So the wheat money was really, really coming in. Well, somebody came into town by the name of Blosser, and he was known by some as a hustler, but he liked to be called Honest Jim. It reminds me of a used car salesman. I'm serious. That is in chapter 35. He likes to be called Honest Jim, and my area where I grew up and where I now reside, which is the city of South Houston, our two biggest industries in South Houston are, well, actually, there are three big industries. Number one is used car lots. There's 29 used car lots in a 1 square mile area, which I think is a lot. The other is taverns. We have a lot of taverns in South Houston. And the third industry in South Houston is houses of ill repute. I guess they call them topless joints or something like that. Anyway, they're exotic dancers. I see some of you are laughing. Most of you aren't. But that's the third industry in the hamlet of South Houston. South Houston is also a small town. South Houston is a town of 13,000. Much larger than Gopher, Prairie, but a lot of things are the same. I was thinking about bringing some information, some newspaper clippings on South Houston, but the current thing that's going on in South Houston are impeachments. We have 3 different impeachment suits against some of the councilmen in South Houston. We're trying to get that. I'm working with the mayor to try to televise the city council meetings. It's once every 2 weeks on Tuesday, and if anyone in the television audience, doesn't have anything better to do that night, please come. There's no charge, and bring your own popcorn. Anyway, but I didn't want to mention that. I didn't want to really get into that, making parallels between South Houston and Gopher Prairie, because of the fact that South Houston is surrounded on 3 sides by the city of Houston and on 1 side by the city of Pasadena. So it's not, there's really not that much to compare, other than the fact there's a lot of gossip, there's a lot of impeachments, and there's a lot of problems. I won't go into it, but South Houston has an interesting and fiery history, and you need to look into that if you ever want to laugh. Back to business. Okay, so anyway, Blosser came in, and he wanted to revitalize the town. He wanted to bring industry in and all of this and all of that, and I think he was getting a little bit of graft on the side as well. So he was really wanting to do that. Carrie didn't want that to happen. Carrie wanted the town to remain the same, which kind of sounds weird because she first wanted to change it. She came to town, wanted to change it. Now here is Honest Jim trying to change it for her and stealing her thunder and stealing her glory. On to chapter 36. The debate continued between Kennicott and Carrie over the impact of Honest Jim and the impact he was having on their town. He can't understand why she's against the very thing that she dreamed for and wanted once she moved to the town. I couldn't either, but I guess it's back to ego, you know. I mean, if somebody else steals your thunder, it's kind of hard. News came that a socialist had sought to address a farmers group in a nearby town, and he was run out of town by on a rail, literally. The sheriff warned him not to do it, and of course he did it, and of course he paid the penalty for that. Another piece of interesting legislation, in 1918 there was something called the Sedition Act, and it made criticism of the war effort punishable. It was illegal to utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States or the Constitution. Boy, I'll tell you, that was still in force. We'd all be in jail. But I like this country, so not me. Dyer's Drugstore, and later at home, Kennicott and Carrie continued to debate about patriotism, about the war effort, about that incident with the socialist. They continued to argue, and finally, Carrie said, well, I'm leaving. I think this was a separation. It seemed like it was a separation. She went off to Washington. The Dauntless published a kind of sugar-coated article that she had gone off and she was helping the war effort and all this and all that, but I think the doctor knew the real truth about it. Once she was in Washington, she finds employment with the Bureau of War Risk Insurance. She had some misgivings about that, but she gradually enjoyed her life in Washington and the cultural attractions she was able to partake of. Hugh was left in the care of a nurse while at work. I find that kind of interesting because now the big debate is child care and single parents, single mothers in particular, and the fact that they can't find affordable child care anywhere to take care of their children. You know, people say if you're a single parent, we'll back up to Canada, you know, because I have a lot of friends and family in Canada, and in Canada we have socialism and so forth and so on, you know, paid child care, and if you don't want to work, they'll give you money and stuff like that. And here in America, we have that too, but a lot of women who are single parents refuse to do that. They feel that they should work and receive their own money from their own work. But if you have a child, how can you do that? Someone's got to take care of the child. There are a lot of latchkey children in this country that are latchkey children for the very fact that we don't have a way for them to be taken care of while their mother or their father or both of them work. So anyway, on to chapter 37. Wait, we've already done 37. Well, on to 38. After living in Washington for about a year, she grew tired of the office. She had tea in a restaurant. She noticed a group of young women, ingenues, all in their late teens, and she suddenly feels old and faded. She's about 31 at this point. On the way home, she meets her old friends from Gopher, Prairie, Harry and Juanita Haydock. In the City of Strangers, she found some genuine friends. They reminisce. They talk about Honest Jim Blosser, who has left Gopher Prairie, and apparently he took the town boosting campaign with him. Okay, she also sees the famous Percy Breshnanen, president of the Velvet Motor Company. As you know from the first few chapters, that's all they seem to talk about. He's the big claim to fame there in Gopher Prairie. After 13 months after she left Gopher Prairie, the doctor comes for a visit. Their meeting was somewhat subdued. They both didn't know how they'd receive each other at this point. When he finds that, that his other approach isn't succeeding, he proposes that they take a 2-week holiday. She calls it a second honeymoon, but he refers to it as a second wooing. They go to Charleston. She's undecided. She doesn't know whether to go back or whether to stay, or whether to go back or whether to stay, and she wants him to make the decision for her. Well, he does the smart thing, which is what I would have done, is said, well, the decision is yours, honey. I'm not going to do that for you. And so the only thing he wanted to do is make sure she's happy. So he leaves, and she still feels indecisive, and she talks to leader of a suffrage movement, the big chieftain of the suffrage movement, and she gives her a lot of advice, and she finally says, well, I think it'd be best that I go back home. On the way home, she finds she's pregnant, presumably from the second wooing. Chapter 39, Carrie is pleased to be at home and that all of her friends have missed her. The big topic is prohibition, as I told you before, about prohibition being passed, and noble experiment, and so forth, and the varied ways to get around that law, like making bathtub gin and so forth and so on. Even out in the small towns, that was what was done. You can't take away something people enjoy and expect them to just roll over and go away. And I don't drink, I'm sorry, but I know people do, so especially in Houston. I should say, especially in South Houston. Yeah, right. Right after you bought a used car. Anyway, she began working for Vita Sherwin. She worked in the restroom. Now, restroom then was not quite what a restroom is now. If you think of a restroom now, it's a toilet. But that's not the way it was then. It was a room where people went to rest. It was kind of like a parlor, a place where people could relax. And she wore her eyeglasses on the street, which was something pretty daring. She didn't like them; they were uncomfortable, and so she personally, I happen to like, women who wear eyeglasses, but I guess back then that wasn't in vogue, and so I see all of you are taking them off. Anyway, I'm sorry. I couldn't resist. And so she wanted to wear, she thought about wearing spectacles, but she thought that would make her look much older than the 33 years she is. Her baby, born in August, was a girl. She and Kennicott became involved in a heated conversation on how to raise their son, Hugh. The Kennicotts and the Clarks, Sam Clark and his wife, go on a duck hunting expedition. And she, for the first time, carries her own gun, which is a light 12-gauge shotgun. They bag a duck. They go get their duck, and they get in the car, and they drive their dead duck home. And that's for the first time that Carol called Mrs. Clark by her first name, Ethel. Probably some influence of the duck. Carrie makes some rather ominous statements about the future of that her daughter will meet, of her feelings of Gopher Prairie, but it all seems to be lost. All seems to be lost on the doctor. His mind is occupied with the snow and replacing the storm windows. Dr. Rothman said that Carrie had given up. I disagree with that. If you'll read the last chapter, and unfortunately I don't have enough time to cover that in depth, but it's on page 451 of my book, fourth paragraph. You'll see that she really was looking towards the future, and she's very much ahead of her time. I think that's one of the reasons why this was controversial, is because for one of the first times, not the first time, but for one of the first times, it put women in a position where they were equal to or even superior to men, where they could do whatever they wanted to do. And she worked, she went to Washington, she reared her own children, and so forth and so on. So I think it was pretty groundbreaking there. I have some photographs I'd like to show you. I brought with me. I was talking about small towns. Actually, I spent some time in a small town, and the small town, I'll put this right in the center, and let's see how we can, there we go. Okay, the small town, which I've spent a great deal of time, as a matter of fact, I'm setting up shop there, it's called Revelstoke, Revelstoke, which is a town of 7,000 population in British Columbia. It's on the Columbia River. The river that you see is the Columbia River. The bridge at the bottom is a Trans-Canada Highway, which goes all the way across Canada from one coast to another. It's the largest or longest man-made paved highway in the world, I believe. The one in the middle is a railroad bridge. That's Canadian Pacific Railway. Revelstoke is a railroad town. I could give you the history of Revelstoke, but I don't really think I'll get into that. But it was based on the railroad. And then the one at the top is a small two-lane highway that linked Big Eddy to the right and Revelstoke to the left. The next shot I'd like to show you, this is how the town receives its power. This is the Revelstoke Dam, which is a hydroelectric dam. Generates power for BC Hydro, for Revelstoke, as well as the rest of the Okanagan. And here's another one of the dam. This is looking down. These are aerial photographs. I rented a plane and flew over Revelstoke and took some pictures of it. Okay, the next one I'd like to show you, and this really puts you in the mind of Gopher, Prairie, right here. There it is right there. That's the main street in Revelstoke. That's Mackenzie Avenue. Donaldson's Drugstore, the boutique, so forth and so on. Here's another picture. This is another street. Okay, here's the main street looking back down towards City Hall. That's Mackenzie Avenue. The satellite dishes are the cable TV company. It's really isolated. The only way to get to town is either to drive to town or to take a bus there. They used to have rail service go there, passenger rail service, but they don't have that anymore. And they have a small airport, but no commercial service, so it's really isolated.
Where's the barber shop?
Excuse me?
Where's the barber shop?
The barber shop, it's right down the street. I don't think you can see the barber shop. I think the barber shop is over here, and believe it or not, I think the barber shop is right there. And believe it or not, a lot of people congregate in the barber shop and talk about everything. And no, it's okay. Let me bring out some more pics for you. I'm only going to show you a couple more of Revelstoke, and then I'll move on to show you some of the prairies where Gopher Prairie was actually situated. Okay, That'll be good. Here's your post office. And the last picture, that's the newspaper in town. That's the Revelstoke Review. The Revelstoke Review has been bought out, and it's now part of a big conglomerate. The reason that I mentioned about Revelstoke is a small town, and word travels very quickly between the town and between the residents of happenings within the small town. I have been in Revelstoke for many, many times, about 8 different times for extended stays, and you'd be surprised how quickly word travels, and it's just like Gopher, Prairie. Well, I've enjoyed speaking with you tonight, and I've enjoyed sharing these things with you. One of the pieces last week, the first piece, I believe Karina gave it, and I wanted to speak to Karina about her feelings about Main Street and Gopher Prairie, simply because of the fact that she seems to share a lot of my feelings about the book. But unfortunately, she's out in the TV audience, and I'm in the...
Thank you for a very fine presentation.
Thank you, Doctor.
Almost out of time, but we've seen a small town. We certainly got a feel of the small town life and the attitudes in the town, and I think that we well understand Sinclair Lewis's accomplishment in Main Street. Good night, and have a good year.
Maybe you guys back there can edit that a little bit.